happened to the disability? The milkman, the paper boy, evening TV. Everywhere you look, there's a heart, a hand to hold on to. Everywhere you look, there's a face of somebody who needs you.
The 1920s is a time period known for the shattering of political, economic, and social expectations. It's a time known for the creation of easy consumerism, jazz, flappers, and fun. What is mostly forgotten is that not all people got to enjoy the luxuries of the Roaring '20s. Immigrants especially were mistreated, denied their basic rights, and labeled as the issue to new arising problems in order to ease Americans' paranoia.
The Red Scare was a time period in which immigrants had to suffer in.
As Mr. Wolf so beautifully introduced, the Red Scare was a time period in which immigrants had to suffer in. The term red comes from the reference to calling communists red because of their allegiance to the Russian flag. What started it was the Bolshevik Revolution. In November of 1917, the Bolsheviks took over Russia and installed communism. Americans believed that if Russia could be conquered, a similar group could take over them. The ideas of radicalism in relation to communism became a very unsettling and later a very scary idea. The paranoia that began to grow became directed at immigrants. Partly, the creation of the Communist Party of the USA in 1919 made Americans more paranoid about the rise of communism, and as a result, very defensive against those who weren't born in America. Nativism became the excuse to treating immigrants poorly. The Bolshevik Revolution started the Red Scare, but it wasn't the only reason. Here's historian Noah Keller to talk about the impacts of World War I on the views of immigration.
Thank you, Julia. World War I was called the Great War for a reason. With so many different nations at war and so many different uses of propaganda, it was inevitable that our views and opinions on different nations would change as a result. President Woodrow Wilson had promoted the idea of forgiveness and leniency in order to maintain lasting peace in Europe. But the European allies didn't listen to him during the Treaty of Versailles, and the American general public evidently didn't listen to him either. After hearing the monstrosities the Germans had committed during the war, the American public began to show massive prejudice towards those of Germanic heritage, as well as those of Irish heritage, which were viewed as sympathizers to the German cause. Beyond war grudges being a cause for hostilities, Russian immigrants were also persecuted because of the Red Scare and the view that communism was a plague to the American way of life. This hatred was shown in multiple different ways in America, from boycotting and attacking immigrant businesses to tightening the restrictions on immigration as anti-immigrant sentiments began to grow within the country.
Hello, didn't see you there. Well, after the First War, the nation was desperate to get back to the normalities of the time before the war, and as a result of this, progressive movements and many other groups pushing for social change were outcasted and shunned. The spirit of Americanism flourished, and as a result of this, many had the attitude of only true Americans in this country, leading to a troubled relationship with immigrants. They were shunned and condemned by society, leading to the National Origins Act in 1924. This anti-immigrant policy was made into an official law stating that immigration would be heavily restricted among immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Asians were most directly affected by this law.
World War I wasn't the only thing that inspired anti-immigrant sentiments within Americans in the 1920s. The rise of the Bolsheviks and the Red Scare also led to a hatred to immigrants, whose political views threatened the classic American lifestyle in the 1920s, this being anarchists, socialists, and communists. Anarchists believed that all government was hurtful and unnecessary. Socialists believed in heavy government regulation of production to benefit the working class, and communism is complete government takeover of the means of production. All three of these ideologies were viewed as radical and threateners of the American way of life, and massive prejudice was shown towards the individuals, who were often immigrants, who carried these beliefs.
And we're back with historian Mr. Noah Keller, and I'm here to ask the really important questions. So, Mr. Keller, How was the Sacco and Vanzetti trial symbolic of the immigration in the 1920s?
Well, these certainly were times of great tension within our country, and nothing symbolizes the views on immigrants during the 1920s more aptly than the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. On July 14, 1921, what could only be described as a rigged trial was conducted and placed two Italian men, Sacco and Vanzetti, on death row for a crime the court had very little evidence of them committing. Neither had any prior criminal record, but they were well-known anarchists and anti-war activists, and that was enough to condemn them to death. There was some who cried out for their release, but the overwhelming atmosphere of fear and animosity towards the immigrants and men of those with those radical ideals had sealed their fate. And on August 23rd, Sacco and Vanzetti were given the electric chair and put to death. Whether or not they actually committed the crime still remains a question today, but it is undeniable that the trial was the perfect symbol for the persisting prejudice against immigrants in that time period.
Thank you so much, Noah. It's a pleasure to work with you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
As the number of immigrants grew, many needed to find jobs, and as a result of this were hired into lower-paying jobs with low-quality conditions. Soon after, unions began to form, and immigrants united to protest against the poor working conditions they faced each day. Branching off of the anti-immigrant policy prominent after the war, a spirit of anti-unionism became common throughout the United States. Many anti-unionists used lockouts, wage cuts, and private police forces to assert their control over these workers. An increase in violent and aggressive tactics was also prominent at this time period, and there was much unrest throughout society as a result. Even public safety officials, such as firefighters and police officers, were sick of the cruel treatment from employers and protested publicly against them. The police strike of 1919 was the most prominent example of this movement. In Boston, Massachusetts, a group of police officers, fed up with the low wages they were forced to adhere to, united with the American Federation of Labor to protest these conditions. Largely Irish immigrants, the resulting protests led the city to enter into a small panic, resulting in a spike in crime and a societal freakout. The spirit of animosity among unions was heavily present during this strike, and finally, Governor Calvin Coolidge made it into official law afterwards that all public safety officials were no longer allowed to strike at the expense of public safety.
One of the many awful things that was a result of the prejudice towards immigrants was bombings. Here is historian Caroline Tiernan to speak about her information.
Thank you, Julia. Many bombings occurred in the 1920s as a result of these radical ideologies brought in from immigrants across America. One of the most infamous cases of this happening was the 1920 bombing of the J.P. Morgan and Company building. On September 16, 1920, a horse-drawn cart carrying 1,000 pounds of explosives was brought into the J.P. Morgan and Company building and exploded, resulting in the deaths of 40 innocent people. Historians believe that the most likely culprits were anarchists, trying to fight against capitalism by striking one of the most successful businesses of the time period. Many more instances of the bombings, for the sake of demonstrating one's ideology, occurred during the time period, such as the Haymarket Affair, the Wall Street bombing, and many more.
Who supported all of these attacks was A. Mitchell Palmer, otherwise known as Alexander Mitchell Palmer. Alexander Mitchell Palmer was an attorney general from 1919 to 1921 under President Woodrow Wilson. He is known to be one of the most controversial U.S. attorneys in American history because of his impulsive mass arrests against anyone suspected of being a communist or socialist. His aggressive behavior and tactics sparked a movement of protection of civil liberties. Ironically, when Wilson offered Palmer the position of Secretary of War after he won the presidential election in 1912, he declined based on his Quaker religion, which promotes pacifism. Wilson's attempt to have him serve in many other positions, but nothing else satisfied Palmer's insatiable hate for the communist movement and immigrants. Although his raids were ruinous and unconstitutional, as an after effect, more concerns arose about more protection for civil rights and liberties. The event that led to the official end of the Red Scare was the event known as the Palmer Raids. On the night of January 2nd, General A. Mitchell Palmer ordered federal agents to raid homes, restaurants, pool houses, and other venues and arrest any supposed radicals or communists. About 10,000 people were arrested and their rights were denied. Searches were done without a warrant, those in prison did not receive bail, and immigrants were sent back to Ellis Island to face cases without lawyers and inevitably be deported. Although this ended the violent attacks, it only set the standard socially that it was okay to deny immigrants basic American rights.
In conclusion,
although there were a lot of people who experienced the positive effects of the 1920s, immigrants quite literally had the door shut on them. These behaviors not only terrorized immigrants physically, but they also carried into social expectations that immigrants were not allowed to accept basic American rights.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of History Out Loud. Make sure to
Like, subscribe.
And leave a comment down below what we should do next week.
thank you for watching.